Welcome everyone to Intersection, where theology and practice meet. This is a lovely day, and we're looking forward to a conversation with Stephen Bullivant. My co-host Randy Harris and I are delighted you're joining us today. And Stephen, thank you for joining us all the way from London, England.
Pleasure.
Welcome.
Total pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the program today. Just a word about Stephen. Stephen is a professor and teaches in areas of theology and sociology at the University of St. Mary's in London, and also has faculty roles with the University of Notre Dame in Sydney, Australia, which is a very wide. You've got a wide-ranging scope of research and directing doctoral dissertations and teaching, as well as your own publishing and writing. Stephen's book called Nonverts came out a couple of years ago, Oxford Press, and it's around that theme that we'll be talking today with the title of What Happens When People Leave Church. Stephen, thanks for joining us today. We're just so delighted.
Total pleasure. Really delighted to be here.
It's great. And for those of you who are joining us, I see names popping up here from lots of different places. So lovely to have you all here. For those of you who are a part of our seminar today, this webinar, let us know through chat, speak to each other that way. If you've got questions for Dr. Bullivant as we get deeper into our program today, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask those questions. And I suspect we'll have a lot of good questions come today with this topic about the reality of people leaving churches, leaving communities of faith in varied kinds of ways in North America today. So use the Q&A for that. What else do I need to say? Just delighted to have everyone here, and we'll introduce this topic and get started with questions with Stephen in just a few moments. But first, as we do, as our practice on Intersection, I would invite you to a minute of silent prayer. Let's recognize the presence of God in and through our conversations today and ask for his blessing. Would you be silent for a minute with me? O gracious God, creator, redeemer, and sustainer of all through the power of your Spirit, we ask for your blessing in this conversation today, that those of us who serve as pastors and ministers and leaders and believers in communities of faith, that you would give us insight and wisdom as we seek to be faithful to your call in our lives through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, Stephen, let's just kind of get started here. You use this language of the ex-Christian era, the ex-Christian America. Talk to us a little bit about what has given rise to the reality that we face. I think for many of us in North America, we talk about the rise of the nuns, but and that's part of the narrative you're telling. But you're saying a little more than that, I think. But set the table for us here.
Yeah, so the idea is, I mean, you're right, the rise of the nuns is kind of almost what the book leads with, but the argument is that this is the bigger symptom of a much kind of bigger phenomenon. And the basic argument there is, well, first of all, that, as many of you will know this, that the move that people make when they tick the no religion box on a survey, these aren't people who were last week Bible believing, fully signed up at the local church every week Christians, right? to get to the point of no longer ticking the box, has often been a very gradual and often a generational kind of weakening of the faith. And so the argument is that the point at which it's about a third of adult Americans tick no religion, is a very different sort of country from one in which, say, 20 years ago, a lot of people who didn't believe, didn't practice, had no real connection apart from maybe a family connection, but no personal connection to any kind of religion, would still have ticked the box. And in a sense, that's a very surface level change, but a world in which the people who don't believe, don't practice, don't really have any connection, but still tick the box, tells you something about the overarching kind of cultural climate.
Right.
And the argument is that it changes where you are in the country, but a large part of what we used to mean by kind of Christian America has weakened very substantially.
Yes, I was just seeing stats that show that maybe in Gen Z, that maybe 51 up to 51% are either atheist, agnostic, or don't care
Yeah,
kind
exactly.
of posture. So, as a researcher, and you've been looking at this for a long time, what might be one or two or three leading things that may give rise to that? What would be some things you would name
Sure.
for us, that
Well,
factors?
there's a kind of a national story and personal stories that you can tell, and I think the
Mm,
national story probably takes you back to the 1960s, and then you can tell a kind of a prequel story about how you got to the 1960s, but
mm,
there's this kind of a growing gulf between mainstream morals, if you like, kind of what you see
mm,
in films, in books, in kind of, I don't know, and again, it's different where you are in the country, and traditional Christian views on divorce,
right.
abortion, homosexuality, um, various other things too. And contraception was kind of probably a generation before. Um, but one of the arguments is that there's been this kind of growing gulf that's only got bigger and bigger and bigger. That on the one hand has affected the churches themselves. So we've seen churches kind of rent apart, schisms, um, congregations splitting. Um, but we've also seen this kind of bigger national thing of this kind of view that, these views are this kind of idea that the churches have lurched to the right, this kind of religious right, moral majority, which you often see sociologists say. And one of the things I make in the book is, well, it takes two sides to have a culture war. And the argument is that actually the great mass of kind of liberal popular media opinion has shifted largely to the left. So this is kind of the big backstory.
Mhm,
And then depending on which denomination you're in, it plays out very
mm,
differently. I think one of the
right.
two big events were the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. So the kind of the classic godless communism versus Christian America
Mm,
kind of when that stopped and you had a generation who came of age, this is millennials, who weren't raised in this world, and then suddenly the big enemy is no longer people with no religion, it's people with kind of too much religion, it's extremism.
mm,
um then whereas in the past a lot of people who weren't necessarily connected still felt that, well, if you're American, you've got to be some kind of Christian, even if we'll tick the box and we'll still kind of feel like we're a Baptist because that's the family, and that, or whatever, Catholic, because that's the family tradition.
mhm,
um
mhm,
that really shifted with this generation coming of age after the Cold War. And then again, the internet is it's a bigger thing for Mormons, say, or Jehovah's Witnesses, or groups that were much more kind of walled off from mainstream
yeah.
American culture. But the rise of the internet in the late 90s, early 2000s also has this kind of big relativizing effect. But it also allows you to find, but if you have doubts and you live in kind of small town Kansas, spent a lot of time in small town Kansas, um, and you kind of have doubts, well, you don't, before the internet comes along, you don't really have anyone to talk to about them. You might talk to a youth minister or whatever, but you're not going to kind of go to the local atheist society because there isn't one. But on the internet, you can suddenly find a whole world of other people very much in your position who become this kind of support group network, kind of counterculture. So there's all sorts of things going on, and then it's, as I say, it's just kind of, that rise of the nons has just kind of grown and grown and grown.
Right.
That worked a bit differently in America than it did in England and Europe, right? It seemed like in England and Europe, it took place earlier and over a much longer period of time. And it felt like in the US, you're obviously arguing this isn't quite true, that it happened in 2 decades, and I mean, the internet certainly made possible for people to make choices they couldn't make before because they found out they weren't the only Mormon kid in Idaho who had questions. But so it was churches here got kind of caught flat-footed because it woke up and all of a sudden. But I think if I understand, part of your argument is there were already lots of non-verts in churches. The difference is they left now. They were already sitting there.
Some of them were sitting there, but a lot of them were not necessarily sitting there, but were at least kind of still feeling that they were connected in some way, and would probably then still send the kids to whatever and that kind of thing. And you're quite right. I mean, one of the things that there was always this opposition, kind of secular Europe, godless Europe, Christian America, which was absolutely true. And America was always the exception. It was the there's this secularization thesis argument that, the kind of the more industrialized Western democracies tend to de-religionize. And obviously America is, the most westernized, the most industrial, the most kind of modern nation. And it didn't for so long. So for me, one of the questions to answer in the book is partly, well, why now? But also, well, why not sooner? What kept America so religiously strong? And it's still much more religiously strong than most other places, right? And again, that's going to look very different depending on where you are in the country. But yes, you've had a very quick shift, and I think part of that was a kind of a pent up demand. That kind of makes sense. But then that has kind of big cultural, people get kind of whiplash, and the people who have really kind of gone secular are often very closely connected still to people who are still very religious. Whereas in Britain, you may be kind of 2-3 generations away from people who really practiced and really believed. And your parents may have had you baptized at the Anglican church, but you never no one ever really took it seriously, and you never really practiced and never believed. Whereas in America, if your parents are still there every day and every week in church praying for their prodigals to come home, and it creates all kinds of intra-family tensions at Thanksgiving with sisters-in-law and all sorts of people. So it's all it's much kind of rawer and much kind of realer in America, I think. And I think that plays out on the cultural sphere as well. There's this kind of real cultural whiplash going on, between people who have left but feel they have a dog in the fight, and therefore have this kind of allergic reaction to religion, in a way that people in Europe, like, religion's a thing that people do, but it's not a personal thing to most people who don't do it. Whereas in America, that can be very different.
So your book made me go on a personal quest to find my non-verts. That is students or others I taught in the past who have really opted out. And all their stories are a bit different. You can't just it's not an easy explanation, but I don't think they're coming back. How do you feel about non-verts in terms of is this really going to be about their children? Because once they're gone, they don't seem like they're coming back.
No, I think just to clarify that the idea of the non-vert is people who were raised religious and in America predominantly Christian, who now identify as no religion. That's kind of the base level definition. I think you're right. I think that for a long time, and in Britain, churches have had been used to this for a very long time. Which kind of means they're a bit too complacent about it. They just kind of assume that young people don't go to church. They don't really, expect them to, and don't really. Mainline churches in America are a bit like this as well. Like, why would a 20-something want to go to church? Which means that you don't put in the effort to kind of keep any of them. You just assume that they've all gonna go if they were there in the first place. I think certainly a majority of people who've left and got to the point of no longer ticking the box, because often people are still ticking them. Now, a lot of people, emerging adulthood, have doubts, fall out of faith, are moving around the country, going to college, moving for work, not settling down, and then, settle down and then, reconnect with church. That we know that happens. I think the people who've got to the point of no longer ticking the box, even some of them will come back, and you get these revert stories, and probably any decent sized church will know some of those people. But I think the danger is that we then assume that, well, because we know sort of the 220-somethings we know at church are the ones who come back, and the churches don't see the people who don't. And this is obviously very personal and kind of heartbreaking for a lot of people, because it's not just numbers on a chart, it's people's sons and daughters and family members, and the kids your kids grew up with, and yeah.
Well, let's pick up on that a little bit. So when a person becomes a non-vert, this young adult, two of which maybe make their way back into church, but there's 100 that never do. Those non-verts. So define that a little more fully for us. Let's think about what kind of choices have they made along the way to come to a place of not just simply not going to the church they grew up in, but actually, as I read your book, you're actually saying there's some intellectual, and emotional source of shifts that a person makes to move to that space that are really kind of hard to undo.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about what is a non-vert?
Yeah,
what kind
sure.
of choices have they made to get to that place?
Well, first of all, I mean, it plays. We just heard it. Randy just said it plays out very differently. Individuals, which is the same with
Yes.
conversion narratives. You can listen
Sure.
to. You're going to get commonalities. You're going to get patterns. I've gone the other way. I was a non, and then became a Christian in my 20s. So it's the same when you go the other way. So they're all different. And one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to sort of show how mainliners, they're all different too, but there's kind of there's a kind of a more of a commonality between them than there is among ex-mainliners and ex-evangelicals, ex-Catholics, ex-Mormons. So even within that, often, I mean, these are people who have been raised in two worlds, and so being raised in mainstream American culture, even if you're also raised in a firm Christian family and wider community, anytime you kind of watch the TV, unless it's a particular Christian channel, you're not going to see a world that's reflective of the kind of world that you're grown up in. When you go away to, I don't want to kind of play the people go away to liberal colleges and then they all, but when people move away, people get out of the habits that they were kind of raised in. And as geographic mobility has changed, people move for work, people move for college, people have to move, and that has a kind of a destabilizing effect on people's faith. Right. Kind of just the habits, and then the habits become the new normal, and then over time, people who at one point had always intended to find a church and get back into it, then realize years down the line that actually never did and don't really miss it. There's that kind of thing. LG, gay rights, people, the younger generation, they often talk about sex, of course, but deep cultural cleavages between traditional Christian morality and mainstream social mores, if you like.
Right.
and abuse, you know, and this is one of the other things that the internet does, which, I mean, I'm a Roman Catholic, and it's been worse for us than anyone, and you know, we've kind of deserved all the fallout we've had. But you know, obviously, for people who in the past they may have, you know, not necessarily known what they believed, or you know, they might only go to church when grandma's in town and that kind of thing, but their history and their heritage was often very important to them, and the sense that, you know, we're an Irish family, or we're a German Catholic family from Bavaria, and this has been passed down to us, and you know, I did my baptism and first Holy Communion, and it's an important thing for my folks, but also for me, that I pass this on to my kids, and they can choose. They get, you know, they can choose like I did. But once that brand gets tainted, once it's no longer a nice family, you know, Irish and St. Patrick's Day and Guinness kind of thing, and the dominant note in that brand identity is, for people who have no other reason to be connected, is abuse or something like that, then for people who are already quite disconnected, that can then be the thing that stops them even kind of putting their name to it. For people who are more connected, scandals tend to hurt more, but they tend to not have as big an effect on their kind of faith identity, because they've got many more reasons that keep them there, that they can put the bad stuff in context. For people who don't have that, you know, the bad stuff is all they've got really left. And so again, it's bigger in the main lines and the Catholics, but you know, when you're a couple of generations away from kind of weekly church going and really believing and really kind of it being a big part of your core identity, then obviously abuse, crisis, and scandals is going to have a big part on your kind of, you know, what do I see myself as? And that, you know, there's elements of that in people who've left evangelical churches too, of course.
It seems to me that in evangelicalism in America, part of it is scandal, but part of it is when you have the politicization of the church. If your politics no longer can line up there, you know, it's just easier to leave.
Yeah.
Because the political identity seems to run deeper than the religious identity does.
That's certainly what people say, and some of the people I interviewed in the book, you know, said that you know, they'd moved away with their own politics, but the church and also their parents' politics had become so entwined with their kind of evangelical identities, that actually to reject one was to reject the other.
Right.
And it's also true, of course, and this is really important. And I was in Notre Dame talking to kind of liberal sociologist professors, and I stressed the point that also, though, the kind of the evangelical and republicanism, but also the Donald Trump thing more recently, has probably kept quite a lot of people in who would otherwise have stopped ticking one of the Christian, but they're not kind of churchgoers, but because their politics does align, that it's kind of kept them in. The evangelical brand identity has kind of been affirmed by the politics in the way that it kind of is repellent to others. So that's also important to stress, I think, because you often only hear one side of that.
Seems like bad news either way.
Yeah, well, the danger for churches is that, you know, American churches always did a very good job, but it was much easier. And this is one of the points I make about since the 1960s. It was much easier for politics not to be kind of denominationally charged, because it was possible to be, say, a pro-life Democrat. It was possible to be a kind of, you know, a Southern Democrat who, you know, stood up for the workers at the local coal mine and whatever. And it wasn't a kind of a religious choice who we voted for. And one of the big shifts in the 70s, 80s, 90s has been the political polarization. And because politics includes big moral questions, which churches also do, it's almost unavoidable that, okay, you know, even not at the level of kind of individual candidates and that kind of stuff, but that people are going to feel torn politically, morally, religiously.
I'm curious, you were sort of talking earlier about habituation, where some people just kind of slide away,
Yeah.
they move and so on and so forth. You're really cautious in your book about COVID, you know, because it's easy to make kind of short term sort of grasp that may not bear out over the long term. But you're not in print now. Do you want to take a
Well,
shot?
also, I mean, I finished writing that book kind of 3 years ago. I
Sure.
finished writing that book very
Yeah,
much still
yeah,
in the thick of
you
it.
got a little more time now. What do you think?
Well, I think one of the things, and this plays out differently in different bits of America. Certainly in Britain, we had very serious lockdowns. Churches were closed, so you really couldn't go to church for months on end. And it's been palpably clear here that a lot of people who used to go no longer do, and would have been a point where they kind of kept meaning to go back next week, if that makes sense. You know, like next Sunday, we really ought to get the kids and force them all to go to church, even though they've kind of forgotten what church is. But it was always kind of, let's put it off to next week because, you know, we've got other things on a Sunday now. The kids are a nightmare. I've got 4 kids and they are a nightmare in church. And actually, you know, when there was that period of like, well, we can go back, but we oughtn't to go back because there might be vulnerable people and all someone's coughed, so we don't want to kill people and that kind of and you weren't, especially as a Catholic, there's a kind of a Sunday obligation. You have to be there on a Sunday, you know, pain of mortal sin. But that wasn't in place for a long time. So there was kind of like you could go back, but you know, we weren't fearful of our, you know, whatever. So I think just getting out of that habit was a big thing for a lot of people. And yeah, it's clear that a lot of the people who were there didn't come back. Now, in a sense, if you were there and a change of habit stopped you going back, that probably says something about how deeply you were there in the first place. Maybe how, you know, it may have been that this was the change that you needed. If you'd moved house maybe and, you know, never got round to finding a new church, you know, some people who move house, that's the first thing they do, right? But if you're not that person, then you can kind of keep doing what you've been doing for a long time. But if there's a change, then you might get out of the habit. And I suspect that's certainly been part of it. I think the other thing that we see with the pandemic, and what you talk about this in the book, and what you'd expect to see is, and then this happened, you know, whenever there's a kind of big catastrophe, and after the Civil War was a big example, you get a kind of a big resurgence of religion. You get a kind of after the Second World War as well, a big boom in religion, a big kind of boom not only of mainstream religions, but of kind of weird fringe religions that kind of like there's this kind of spiritual ferment. And I'm not quite sure we've seen that much of that. But it is possible that we're beginning to see people who had kind of big questions triggered for them during the pandemic. You know, people close to them died. You know, we've been very fortunate in our parts of the world that we've been buffered from mortality quite significantly. For, you know, we've not had a big epidemic since the Spanish flu. You know, modern medical care kind of keeps us, especially at infant mortality, kind of buffers us most of the time away. Certainly in a young adulthood, you know, I was well into my 30s until a grandparent died on me. You know, it's that kind of thing. Now, in the past, you'd have been much closer to close family members dying and those kind of questions being raised. It's possible that COVID kind of confronted people with these kind of questions, and that we maybe start to see some of those kind of conversions are often gradual. People kind of think of them being instant. So we may now be seeing some of those gradual conversions coming to fruition. I suspect that when you interview converts in 30 years' time, or vocation stories say, the pandemic will be a big thing in lots of them. They'll say that was the moment that kind of put me off on a new course. I was meant to go to college then, and I had to stay at home, and then I was reading, and then I was off on another course, or something happened, and then, you know, things changed.
Talk to us a little bit about as you're reflecting here about the multiple ways in which people maintain religiosity or connection to their church life, but then things start to fall away. Some of them are cultural, right? My family is Irish Catholic, so but those start to fade. Cultural kinds of things. There's relational dynamics. My best friend goes to church, so I'm going to go to church with them. Then there are religious commitments themselves that strong enough, they'll hold folks. I'm just kind of curious, so there's relationality, there's a lot of factors going on there, but in some ways, as some of those start to drop away, then obviously they drop away. So talk a little bit about how that has played itself out in nonversion.
Yeah.
Could you name that a little more explicitly for us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, religion is always bound up with so many other things in the society, with economics, with family relationships, with culture, with politics. Okay, because religion's a very important segment of human experience, and so it isn't its own kind of pure thing that is completely siloed off from wider kind of currents or contexts. It's certainly true, and this is, I mean, this is quite I think one of the big drivers of the rise of the nons, and we've talked about Generation Z and millennials, is this kind of generational change. And it's certainly true that, if we look at, there's been a huge amount of excellent social science research on kind of what predicts if people are, predicts whether people grow up to be religiously practicing adults. Okay. And, one of the things is, if you've got two religiously committed parents of the same denomination, that helps. I mean, if you've got a super pious, Baptist and a super pious, I don't know, Reformed Jew, and that kind of happens, you're getting kind of a half dose of religiosity in childhood, right? And you're going to feel pulled in both directions, which may mean that you end up kind of going all in for neither. So the growth of kind of mixed marriages, the growth of family breakdown, the growth of, I mean, and this came out in some of the interviews of, like, the family split, and therefore you were kind of torn between, you might go to church at one place with one set of parents, or not at all with the other ones. And it became too bound up with family politics to kind of go all in. It'd be like betraying the other parent to kind of, join the other denomination. So you just kind of opt out.
Okay.
And obviously, that kind of family dynamic has only risen and risen over time. Okay. So religion is kind of our committedness to religion is always bound up with other things, but equally, if you marry a really, if you're kind of not really very much, and you marry a really committed church-going, husband or wife, over time, the odds are, your kind of risk of converting to whatever they are has really gone up, right? So there's always that kind of push and pull of the people around us.
Stephen needs to step away to attend to something very urgent in his personal life. He'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Randy, I'm just kind of curious, what are some questions that as you hear Stephen talk, as we've reflected on you and I've reflected on his book quite a bit, what are some leading things you think that maybe ministers ought to be thinking about in this time and space? What does it raise for you as a practicing minister?
Well, I think as we kind of turn towards the future, it'd be interesting to hear if Stephen thinks we're in the beginning, the middle, or the end of this phenomenon. I think we're probably somewhere in the middle. And that would mean a period of decline for the next 50 years.
Mm.
And they've been there in Europe for a long time. And so,
Yeah.
okay, how do you do church in that context? There's going to be these big cultural factors you're not going to have any control over, really.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And culture war is not going to really, that's not going to do anything. So what does it mean to be a church in that kind of in that kind of a context? To me, that's the kind of pressing question. What should we be about? What does it mean to be a church? How do you form people in this kind of world? And if you let it, it could be very discouraging, I
Mm-hmm.
suppose. But on the other hand, okay, there's some opportunities for something very authentic here. It's going to be a sorting process, and that how do you deepen that level of religious commitment? That may be the bigger question than how do you get somebody back.
I've wondered as I've talked to ministers. I just got off the road of a 6-day trip in cities in the Southeast, Memphis, Atlanta, among others. It's curious as I think about conversations I see happening in churches that it's actually in some ways sort of doubling down to ask questions. What does it really mean to be thoroughly Christian that churches are having to ask? And what really matters? What really do we attend to, as opposed to worrying about how do we reclaim somebody who left 6 months ago for some reason or another, or a year ago. There's a kind of a commitment to asking what does authentic Christianity look like, and are we willing to move into those kinds of spaces that seem to be pressing on ministers that I see doing really interesting and sometimes joyful work, even though, as you said, Randy, it's often it can be very depressing as well in those times. Okay, Stephen, we've got questions for you now.
Great.
I do, Stephen, one of the things we were talking about was, it's hard to tell whether you're in the beginning or the middle or the end of something. And if I assume we're sort of in the middle of the phenomena that you've described, then okay, the church in North America is going to be at least in numerical decline for the next 50 years. And you're sort of used to that. You're from England and Europe. So what do you tell us about what it means to be a church in that? Because there's going to be these big cultural things we're not going to be able to do anything about.
No.
What is the task of church leaders in churches in that context?
Yeah, I mean, and we're 50, 60 years into that. And actually, we're beginning to see the end point. Like, you get to a point where things never go to zero, right? And you often get, like, if present trends continue, the last Christian, which is nonsense, okay? We're getting to the point in Britain, but also even more so elsewhere in Europe, when the people who are left have to be there for a reason, right? And if you're in your 20s and you're going to church, you know why you're there and you're committed to it, and the people you meet at church are also committed to it. So we're beginning to see growth again. I think that I think the obvious thing is, and again, people on this call in different parts of the country will be more or less familiar with this. The congregations will gradually shrink. I mean, there's no kind of they suddenly fall. So there's a danger because there's always this kind of every year looks a bit like the previous year. Okay, so the danger then becomes, at least for kind of more denominations, if that makes sense, where you kind of think, well, I'll leave it for the next guy, like the bishop or something. I'll be just like, no one wants to close churches. No one wants to merge churches. No one wants to be the guy who closed this parish and merged it with that one and that kind of stuff, because it's an awful thing to do. But we do know that bigger congregations are kind of stronger. If you're going to church in something that's kind of a third full every week, and you're one of the young people, but there's only about 2 other young people, it very easily becomes like, well, this is a kind of a dying thing that we're part of, and like I never really kind of found my group within the church, and it, I never got really embedded into it. I never found my spouse, and then we grew up and raised our kids in the church. Whereas there's a kind of an economies of scale with some churches. And there's a balance there too, because you don't want the kind of these big anonymous churches where no one knows anyone.
Right.
But there is a kind of strength in numbers, and I think actually, as the committed church-going, believing population shrinks, there will be a strength in kind of either uniting congregations or finding ways in which, a youth group that a single church was full. It might be better to have 3, sufficiently cognate churches in a town come together to give a sort of a bigger critical mass of young folk and kind of things like that. So I think that kind of consolidation and scaling down will probably be quite a natural but a very painful and hassle. It's hassle to close things, and it's not what any pastor gets into the church to do. I want to be the pastor who's famous for closing more churches than any, like, but it becomes quite necessary. Now, the counter to that is in different parts of the country, that's going to look wildly different. Like, well, we're growing, we can't build churches fast enough. So I think we're going to see some of this. This is a big thing for, say, Catholics in towns like Chicago or Pittsburgh, or kind of where there's a kind of a massive church every couple of blocks. There's still a fair number of Catholics around, but there's nothing like there used to be, and nothing like the clergy used to be. So every year there's plans to close some other church, right? Whereas different parts of the country, they have to keep opening them. So there's probably going to be a kind of a geographical rebalancing of things as well, I think.
I guess I'm curious, Randy, you said that you were on a bit of a journey with some of the non-verts in your life. You've had some of those conversations?
I have had a few, yes.
I'm curious, and this is playing off of a question that I see from one of our viewers. Do you think that they've walked away from organized church? They've walked away from religion in some sense. Have they walked away from spirituality? Or transcendence, or it's not like have they given up on God altogether, or are they given up on the manifestations of God? This is one of the questions that I think.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a hard question. I mean, transcendence can mean, do they believe in beauty? Well, yes. Justice often, yes, but no, I think they've given up on, and they haven't just given up on church. They've given up on the worldview that includes something like the Judeo-Christian God. And to me, that again, now they're perfectly comfortable ticking the none box, because none of others, that's really what they are. And so if you really press them, well, have you given up on transcendence entirely? Well, they might say no to that, and they might say, well, no, I believe in mathematics, but nothing like. You're not going to get them back by fixing church, because the church may have been part of the precipitating problem, but it's not what's keeping them away.
So I guess I'm curious, as this questioner is, and this is an open question for me too, is with regard to spirituality itself, is that some of the non-verts that I know still have some sense of spirituality about them, or a pursuit of attending to themselves in a spiritual way. What
does that mean?
It means, for example, that they've gone 3 times to walk the Santiago, the way, you know, to take that pilgrimage as someone who doesn't believe really in a Judeo-Christian God is striking to me. That causes me, and so we have these conversations when I'm with this particular person I'm talking about. So, so that's what I find fascinating.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is. Well, I mean, you know, Richard Beck would say they're sneaky, you know, they're sneaky about their spirituality, or not entirely forthcoming, because there's all these things
Right.
um,
Right.
in
Right.
there. But that's a long ways away from any sort of a Christian.
Yes, it is. I think it is. I think it is. And by the way, to our viewers, Stephen will join us momentarily. We've gotten word, so hang on. We'll be able to engage again with Dr. Bullivant here in just a few minutes. So so please hang on. Again, I'm just looking at some of these great questions. One of our questioners reminding us that actually we need to be careful when we talk about millennials. We need to realize that millennials are 40 years old. It's actually their children, the Gen Alpha, that's coming along, that we need to be attending to, and sometimes the far distance in our even our awareness of what may be around us in our communities is an important feature. It can be easy.
My non-verts are not 18.
Right. Yours are probably 40, aren't they?
Yeah, they're closer to, you know, 40 than they are 18.
Yeah.
Um,
And we have yet another generations coming behind those millennials and post millennials, or pre-millennials, as the case may be. Yeah, exactly.
you know, I guess I think that it is interesting to think about, to wonder if there are things you can do on the front end to secure faith of people who are there, to slow down non-version, I guess is the way to say it. What might, you know, it's interesting, after deep commitments for at least 50 years to professional youth ministry, it's hard to see exactly what the outcomes of that have been, isn't it? And that should at least make us pause, like, okay, how's this? And again, it could be that the cultural forces were just so strong that it would have been much worse without that, with that commitment. But it hasn't exactly been an overwhelming success either, I wouldn't think.
Right. And what Stephen said a moment ago before he pulled away, that actually he thinks maybe in Britain, if I understood him correctly, they've kind of hit the bottom and they're actually seeing some upward turn. I think that for many of us who are in ministerial leadership, we're going to find ourselves living in that kind of time, and realizing what we've done in the past may not is not the thing. We're going to have to find something else to attend to live out core Christian faith and hold on.
Stephen is the numbers guy. I think in North America, we're a long ways from the bottom, but he may have a different view of that.
I think the important thing to stress, and I do this whenever I talk to American audiences, is the strength of Christianity in America is much more than it is or was in kind of Europe. So I can't envisage that you kind of go to, you know, you're not going to go Sweden or anything like that, right? And there's a much greater vitality and kind of entrepreneurial spirit and actually just depth of faith, I think, in America than we have. So you're not looking at some kind of, you know, by 2070, you know, but I guess the counter to that is that you've been on a very good run for a very good long time. And the danger is that people suddenly lose heart. And I think it's probably important to kind of inculcate what you might call a spirituality of grit. You know,
Mm.
these are going to be harder times. They're going to be harder times for congregations. They're going to be harder times for families. Okay, and there is that sense that it's a much more uphill push to transmit the faith than it has been, you know, for the past several generations.
Right.
And actually that kind of you know, grace of perseverance, I suppose, is the thing to kind of pray for, because, you know, you do come out the other side of this, you know.
Right. Right. Boy, I am tempted. Stephen, I wonder if we could find another time to have a visit with you and
I'd love to,
continue
and
some
I'd
of the.
love to, and I'd actually love to talk, because I mean, just seeing the places that people are from,
Yeah.
you know, for me, the more I know what I think already, I don't really care what I think, but I want to hear from people on the ground. You know, I'm much more
Yeah.
interested to
Yeah.
hear kind of
Yeah.
what Jay Farris in Amarillo has to say about Kevin Hooper in Midvale, Idaho, or the guy Christopher Perry, I think, from Wichita. But
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
I'm really keen, because especially because it's not a bit of the American church that I know well.
Yeah.
I'd love to do
Yeah.
that. I really would.
Well, I think in interest of time and in your situation, Stephen, et cetera, we'll just try to reschedule a time. And so to those of you who are participating today, um, know that we're going to work to get Stephen back on, and we're going to go at Nonverts some more, right? In some of these cultural and faith generated realities. So maybe what I could do today is simply ask Randy, you and Stephen both to, you know, what are you thinking about? What's the one thing you'd want to kind of name as we close this segment out, knowing we'll come to some other things at another time. What would you want to leave our viewers with today as you think about this conversation that we're having about people leaving church? Randy, I'll let you take a shot at that first, and then Stephen, I'll ask you then next.
I think take a deep breath about the stuff you don't have any control over, and address the things that you do. And I think when you try to control things that are just too big, that are beyond, I think you just get frustrated, and you get to. But if you pay attention to what's right, the ministry that's in front of you, and what you can do, and then see what happens.
I think the big thing I'd say is that, especially to parents or grandparents, or, you know, obviously those ministering to parents and grandparents, it's very common to kind of think, well, what did we do wrong? You know, we've got 5 kids and we thought we did everything right, and you know, 3 of those are, you know, not where we'd want them to be on their faith journeys, shall we say. There's a bigger cultural picture that they're part of, and don't keep praying, don't lose heart, but also, you know, keep families are important, you know, and you know, people go in all sorts of directions, right? And yeah, don't lose too much heart is a kind of, I think, what I'd want to say, because that's I think at the big moment, especially for the people who are still there, that's a big thing that they're kind of dealing with. And there's this huge prodigals literature that I'm aware of as well.
Oh, maybe that'll be part of what we can pick up on and talk about it at a future time. So, Stephen, thank you for being with us today. You've launched us into some great conversation. There's more to be had. We'll plan for a time for that soon. And for those of you who are viewing today, have been a part of this, thank you for your presence, and thank you for the great questions. In fact, Renee, I know you're listening in and monitoring. Let's capture these questions and make sure that Stephen sees them. I think he'll appreciate those questions as he continues his reflection and work. So thank you all for being a part of this. Our next scheduled intersection comes in May the 14th We have Dr. Sean Casey scheduled to be with us that day. Sean has done a lot of teaching and work in public life and theology. And before he retired recently, he spent about 4 years in the Obama State Department, working and leading a department called Religion and Global Affairs. And so we're going to be talking about public life and public theology with Dr. Casey on May the 14th. So be sure to look for that as it comes up and register for that event. So thank you all for being here today. Again, thank you, Stephen, for being with us. And Randy, if I could, I'll just ask you to bless us and we'll close this good hour together.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who's able to keep you from falling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. To the only God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore, world without end. Amen.